Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming along. Welcome to the Globe and Mail Centre. I'm Philip Crawley. I'm the publisher and the CEO of the Globe and Mail. You've got a lovely day for it here, so enjoy the views from the terrace if you get the chance to take a look. The city around this part of Toronto is really changing fast, and this event centre is a very popular venue, not just for events like this, but also for weddings. The best shot is standing at the end of the terrace there with the background of the backdrop of the city, if you fancy that. But thank you also for all those who are joining us virtually across Canada. And before I begin, just acknowledging this is an historic site. It's close to where one of the early Parliament buildings was, hence Parliament Street next door. And obviously the land on which the Globe and Mail stands is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and then Mississaugas of the Credit. Very important topic. Obviously, as a CEO, couldn't be anything more important than how do you make your future workforce as competitive as possible. We are partners with the Century Initiative today, and we've been working with them for a number of years because we believe this is a topic of fundamental importance to the future success of Canada. I hope you all read Andrew Coyne's column in the Globe on Saturday morning. Andrew is one of our best read columnists, and he did a big piece on the whole issue of the Century Initiative's goal of reaching 100 million people in Canada by the end of the century, which we support and believe that that would be very beneficial for this country. So he was particularly making some criticisms of the current stance of the Quebec government on this issue. So I'm sure there will be some discussion of that this afternoon, but the whole question of attracting the right talent, getting the right skills for a rapidly changing economy, and significant gaps that exist. I'm hosting a dinner here tomorrow night on the future of healthcare, where a lot of the people who are going to be at the table for that dinner are thinking about where do we find the skills, the people, how do we change the rules to allow that? Are we paying enough? We did a similar dinner in BC, we did a similar dinner in Alberta, very different kinds of solutions in different places. In BC, they've really thrown a lot of money at recruitment and making some of those very scarce jobs much more attractive from a financial point of view. So that was very interesting. As a company, the Globe and Mail compares itself with what goes on in Toronto or the GTA rather than with Canada. If you compared your diversity numbers across the country, we wouldn't be setting ourselves a particularly high target. If you're setting your standards by what's going on in the GTA, it's a different metric, and that's what we try and do. But we've been very fortunate as we've changed our business. Our business has changed dramatically in the 25 years I've been running the Globe. And the skill sets that we need are very different. And just in the last 6 months, we're deciding what we need to do with ChatGPT and what kind of applications that will have for our business and what kind of risks it represents. So all of those kind of things are happening very quickly. So creating the right kind of workforce with the right kind of diversity, all huge issues for CEOs like me. On behalf of the Globe, I'd like to thank the sponsors who are making the day possible: Palette Skills, Future Skills Centre, World Education Services, and Windmill Micro Lending. And obviously, thank you to our partners, Century Initiative. They're about to release the third edition of their national scorecard on Canada's growth and prosperity. So to share some of the highlights from the scorecard, I'd like to welcome to the stage Lisa Lalonde, CEO of Century Initiative. Lisa.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the warm welcome, Philip. And welcome to our guests and all of our panelists today. I also want to take the time to thank the Globe and Mail once again for hosting this important discussion. You've been a really valuable partner for a couple of years now and have provided a vital platform for discussing an issue that is important to all of us. And of course, we wouldn't be here today without the generous support of our partners and sponsors. None of this would be possible without you. And you may have noticed that Century Initiative has been in the news a lot lately. This kind of public attention, it gives me an opportunity to raise the profile of the issues we care about, and the public dialogue gives you and other Canadians an opportunity to decide for yourselves what you think about our agenda. So I want to be clear, what is that agenda? At Century Initiative, we believe that a bigger, bolder Canada is good for all Canadians and the world. We believe that Canada will be better able to confront the challenges we face if we are a bigger, bolder country. We believe that Canada will be in a better position to protect its citizens, their rights, and our democracy if Canada is a more prosperous, powerful country. We believe that a larger bilingual Canada with 100 million Canadians increases the prosperity of all Canadians, including the linguistic and cultural security of French speakers in Quebec and the rest of Canada. We also advocate for careful and appropriate planning of population growth. That means selecting, settling, and integrating immigrants in a manner that is good for newcomers and good for Canada. It means pursuing population growth in ways that are consistent with our treaty obligations and the interests of Indigenous people in Canada. And it means respecting the constitutional and legal rights of Quebec to manage and control its own immigration so that population growth in Quebec can take place in a manner that supports and enriches the French-speaking population. To grow well and sustainably, we must plan for growth and invest properly in the medium and the long term. That means investing in infrastructure, housing, and public services. And relevant for today, it means investing in our human capital. This year's event is particularly timely. There are worries about the economy and worries that a more insular, less cooperative global economy and society will affect Canada's competitive advantage when it comes to immigration. While Canada remains a welcoming place for newcomers, there is always the risk that that support could erode. We can maintain and strengthen Canadian support for immigration if we acknowledge and address the challenges that will determine whether we can grow sustainably into the future. That is why our work at Century Initiative is so important, and why we began our annual National Scorecard on Canada's Growth and Prosperity Report over 3 years ago. We are the only national organization dedicated to growing Canada's population, and we are the only organization committing to tracking in a truly integrated way the underlying indicators that tell us whether we are on track for the long-term growth and prosperity that we're seeking. Our national scorecard tracks 39 different factors that influence Canada's ability to grow and prosper, both socially and economically. While this year's scorecard shows we are on track to achieve the goal of 100 million people by 2100, it also shows that our progress is slipping on some indicators that will shape whether we grow well, including areas like infrastructure investment, innovation, housing affordability, and climate performance. The scorecard shows that we need to address the productivity challenge we face. We need to increase R&D spending and invest in improved supports for children and families. The scorecard also shows that the number of young people not in employment, education, and training worsened from early pandemic levels, something we're going to talk about a little later. And of course, we're here today to talk about human capital and labor markets. Immigrants have been key drivers of innovation and entrepreneurship and productivity, and could continue doing so in the years ahead, as we documented in our paper that we released in 2021. But we need to do a better job at leveraging immigrants' talents and skills if we're going to compete and prosper globally. And we must improve lifelong learning opportunities so that the workforce can keep up with technological and labor market changes. These are just a few of the key findings in this year's scorecard. If we don't tackle these issues, not only is our ability to grow and prosper threatened, we will likely see support for immigration in Canada decline. And that is not the Canada that any of us want. We are facing incredible disruptions on climate and AI, amongst others. Canada has everything that we need to succeed. But to do so, we have to make bold choices. And that includes the choice to invest and plan for growth. That is why discussions like those that we're about to have today are so important to our future. Addressing our labor market challenges is one of the most important issues for us to ensure our workforce and economy are prepared for the future and prepared for growth. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing in our vision of a bigger, bolder, bilingual Canada, a more prosperous Canada for more Canadians. I look forward to the discussion today. Now, to pick up on some of these themes, I would like to introduce our next speaker. Jean Bovin is head of the BlackRock Investment Institute. He drives the Institute's research on macroeconomics, sustainability, geopolitics, and portfolio construction. Prior to joining BlackRock in 2014, Jean served as Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada and Associate Deputy Finance Minister, serving as Canada's representative at the G7, G20, and Financial Stability Board. Welcome to the stage, Jean.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be joining you this afternoon to talk about what I think are pretty crucial and an important topic. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes to talk about some of the key risks and challenges we think we're facing collectively, not only Canada, but the world as a whole. But that also creates opportunities, depending on how we tackle them. I'm going to start, and I think to me, that's a useful start. We'll see if you believe that this is also a useful start. But 11 years ago, my last speech as a Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada was entitled Aging Gracefully, Canada's Inevitable Demographic Shift. So that was 11 years ago, and I was looking back at this over the last few days, preparing for this presentation, and I think this is a good starting point to talk about some of the issues today. So some of the points I was making in that speech, just to set the stage, back in 2012. One of the points I was trying to make is that the crunch that demographic will represent will be unprecedented in history, was the diagnostic at the time. By 2031, I was quoting that about 1 in 4 people will be over 65 years old in Canada. And those over 80, that were the fastest growing segment of the older population, would be double by 2026. So that's 3 years away now. That was 11 years ago. I was trying to argue that the stakes were very high for Canada. The way I tried to put that into context was that in order to maintain, the way I put it was that if we don't adjust for the aging population, and I'll talk about some of the ways we need to adjust, but if we didn't adjust, we would have to accept as much as a 20% decline in standard of livings or average income per people in Canada without any adjustment. That's just the impact of what aging would represent for Canadians. Aging would put pressure on the labor markets, on public finances, on private savings. And to avoid drastic declines in our standard of living or shifting too great a burden on other generations, there were only 3 options. And that's always the case. That doesn't change. It's either we have more work, we have greater productivity, or we accept to tighten our belt and save more to smooth that out over time. I was trying to also argue at the time, in my role as a deputy governor, that it was not my role or the role of the Bank of Canada to determine the extent of adjustment that would be needed from each of us, or how that should be done through various tools, immigrations, adjustment in productivity, or public finances, and so on. That was not our role to determine that. It was the role of the government and those that it represents to decide what's best for society. But that ultimately, those decisions will bear on how monetary policy needed to be conducted and will have very significant influence. I'm in a different role now, and I just want to reiterate that this is a bit similar. It's not my role to opine on what is the best way to address these challenges, which we'll be discussing over the course of this conference. It is society to decide, and it's elected official to take actions on that. But whatever decisions are made, whether we are addressing these challenges or not, will have massive implications for my current job, which is on how we see opportunities to invest, which regions will likely benefit from these changes, and where we can generate better financial outcomes for our clients. So that's the perspective in which I'm approaching this topic in my current role. And again, but it's a choice for society, but one that is going to be very consequential. The other key point, and that was the starting point of my speech back then, and I want to make it now the transition to what I want to make the assessment, updated assessment now. I was trying to argue, and not only argue, I was making the point that aging population demographics is not only a prospect that has been with us for a very long time, and I was saying that in 2012, but it was one that has been entirely predictable. I'm an economist, struggling with trying to forecast the future. There's a lot of uncertainty when you think about 10, 20 years down the road, not about demographic. This is a piece of cake when it comes to forecasting what's going to happen. So we kind of know pretty well what the demographic will look like 20 years from now. Like we kind of are where we're expected to be 11 years ago when I was talking about these issues. So demographic has this feature. This is a quip from former Fed President Charlie Evans, that it has this feature that given that we cannot give birth to a 20-year-old cohort once at a time, we kind of know what's going to happen 20 years down the road. So the point here is that this is entirely predictable, but what is much less predictable is how we're going to be able to adjust to it, and the flexibility we will have to deal or cope with this phenomenon. So we know what demographic will be, but the environment in which we're going to be having to deal with this is what is difficult to predict. And that's kind of the main theme I want to draw your attention to in the next few minutes. That's the main theme, because to me the main thing that has changed over the last 11 years is not that our view on demographic has really evolved or changed, but our ability to deal with it has changed very fundamentally. I think we're not in as good a situation to deal with these challenges as we were 11 years ago, and the urgency to do something, I think, has only increased. So let me try to spend a few minutes to try to make that case, and to do that, I'll give you a bit of a sense of how the problem was framed 11 years ago, at least in my mind, and now I'd like to take a little of a step back and ask, what is different now? If you, and I think unless you're a 20-year-old, 20 or less, or above 80, I don't want to do some profiling here, but I don't see many of those on either side. Unless you are, most of you are spent your entire career, professional adult life, in a world that was pretty remarkable. Pretty remarkable from a macro perspective. And I won't go around, because we don't have enough time to do that, to try to tease out what was so remarkable about this environment. But it has some very fundamental features that we can question whether they're still with us going forward. One of them was that, I think I date that to a 40-year period. It's not exactly 40 years, but it's about 40-year period where we had a one-way increase in global production capacity that was increasing pretty steadily year after year. in one direction, and was driven by a bunch of factors. Innovation was part of it, massive, innovation. You have to go back to the late 1990s. We were talking about the dot-com bubble, the new economy, but the reality is that this was real. We have experienced a technology revolution. We had a massive integration of the world that was a one-way direction, where the whole name of the game was about efficiency and driving for efficiency in tapping into the global possibilities, building supply chains, seeking places where costs of production were lower. It was really all about efficiency. And it was a world where demographics were a tailwind, not a headwind. We were seeing how things would evolve, but even 11 years ago, demographics were a tailwind to what we were living through. We think, this is a key theme for us in my firm, we think, interestingly, these, I didn't expect that, these will be very impressionistic charts. They will leave you with a feeling, but no sense of precision, because the axes have been removed here. But for a reason I don't fully understand, but we can follow up with the full axis, and there's actual data behind it. I didn't draw them. I didn't draw this. This is the point I'm trying to get at. It turns out you can put dates here, like the part that is between the two peaks is actually between 1980 and 2020. And this has been labeled by some economists as the Great Moderation. The fact that this is the US, but this is true across developed economies, and actually globally, we've seen a massive reduction in macroeconomic volatility during that period. That has been remarkably sustained for 4 decades, and has led many academic economists to ponder, and that was like the most exciting topic when I started my career. What was the reason? What was the reason that has allowed us to achieve this remarkable feat of stability? And there was a big debate in the early 2000s about whether this was due to good policy, the fact that we had been learning how to conduct better monetary policy. We've learned about inflation targeting. We had drawn the lesson from Paul Volcker in the US. But there was an alternative view that it might have been that we've just been lucky. So it was a good luck versus good policy debate. Back in 2000, I have to tell you, you could try to push the good luck story, but you would not go very far. It was pretty much ingrained and a consensus that it was due to what we figured out, good policy, and in large part to central banks. We think that this period of the Great Moderation is unfortunately over. I mean, the chart kind of show that it has broken to some extent. You could say maybe this is only the pandemic. And I just want to draw your attention to the global financial crisis on this chart. You don't have the date. It's unfortunate, but it's kind of the blip you see in the red line before the large increase. This is 2008. Even the global financial crisis was still within the context of a pretty stable global environment. And so we managed to, go through the global financial crisis, which was a pretty, clearly a dire situation in many ways, but still something that remained overall in the context of a pretty stable environment. We think things have changed very materially, and it's not only due to the pandemic that has been a shock for the last 2 years. I think there are big trends that have changed, coincidentally, more or less at the time that the pandemic hit in 2020. These 3 changes, and I'll spend a few minutes to unpack them, but these 3 changes are first, there are no particular order, but I'm going to list first the climate transition. That has become something real starting in 2018, 2019, has become front and center not only of policies, politics being implemented, but also our clients and financial markets have been paying a lot more attention, and companies have started to adjust to the climate transition. The climate transition, I mean, this is not about climate transition, what I want to talk about here, but this is one of the big trends, and it's a trend that means that at least for the next decade, production will be more challenging. Producing will be more costly because we're adjusting to a new energy mix. It's going to require frictions, adjustment, retooling of the global economy, and all of that, at least for the time being, will mean higher cost of production. So maintaining the same level of activity or growing the economic pie globally will be more difficult in the context where we're transitioning from a climate perspective. The second big trend is geopolitics. Geopolitics has changed. You could use other words to describe that. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But the way the world globally is engaging is very different from the last 40 years. There is obviously tensions across different blocks of the world now that are a lot more acute than they have been for the last 40 years. And it manifests itself in many ways, but I'll say two key ways that are important and will drive to higher production costs. The first one is that companies now are thinking about the global playing field very differently. And this is not anymore about efficiency when you think about your global operation, but it's about resilience. It's about resilience to geopolitical risks that you need to guard against. And it's about resilience to pandemic that can appear, lockdown that can appear in different parts of the world. And these two examples lead to need for duplicating production capacity, having duplicated supply chain, and that means higher cost of production. The other related change of the geopolitics is that, and this is a massive change, the pecking order globally in terms of consideration that are driving interaction globally is not about economics anymore. The last 40 years were if you go to the G20, I've been representing Canada on the G20, the finance track, the track of the finance minister and central bank governors was kind of driving the entire G20 agenda. That's not the case anymore. This is driven more by foreign policy, national security, and so we have now geopolitics geopolitics used to be about economics imperative, and now economics consideration are subsidiary objective. All of that means that we're operating in a world that's going to be more costly in terms of production. And then the last piece is demographics itself. Demographics has basically turned a corner more or less around 2020, where the aging population, which we saw coming, was the most easy predictable thing to see coming, started to be a binding force in more or less 2020, and now is, in fact, a key driver of the labor market. It's a key driver of the inflation environment that we're seeing. We're going even more impressionistic now. We're going nihilistic. I love that. The 3 point what I would have shown you to unpack this a little bit was a couple of things. One is if you look at the demographic impact now on the labor market, spend a lot of time on just trying to think about, oh wow, this is good. This is how it looks like. So you see, I was not lying. You see that in the line, the date now, or as I told you, hopefully I'm building a bit of credibility here. So the next thing is that I want to show you here is this globalization trend. I've already give you kind of the narrative, but in terms of the data, look at this period from, after the World War II, but throughout the last 4 years, massive acceleration, and that has stalled. This is what the chart on the left-hand side is showing you. We've reached a plateau in terms of globalization, and now, in fact, over the last couple of years, things have changed even more materially. I just to speak to the climate transition team, this is the annual green investment that we've seen so far and that are planned going forward. That's going to create massive opportunity in terms of investment, but it also means that as we're adjusting, we're going to see higher production costs. And as I've mentioned, demographics, the third piece, is one where now we're seeing, the tailwind turns into a very significant headwind. And as you can see from this chart, you have the US, China, and Euro area, but as a whole, we're going to see 2020 is where we see things going from positive to negative. That's the shift in the tailwind to headwind. Again, the pandemic coincidentally happened mostly, more or less at the time, has attracted attention, but these big trends were happening. This means that the environment we're in is a lot more difficult to manage, to stabilize for policymakers. We are facing globally much sharper trade-offs between stabilizing inflation and growth. During the Great Moderation, stabilizing the economy, even in 2008, turned out to be pretty easy. I don't want to be oversimplistic, but I was coping with trying to deal with the post-2009, 2008 crisis, and it was not necessarily easy as you were living it. But the reality is that the whole policy prescription was to do as much easing as you can, and if it's not enough, do more. It was coined very powerfully by Mario Draghi with whatever it takes. If you're facing an environment like the last 40 years where the fluctuations are happening around a steady increase in global capacity, and it's really like spending that is like moving around, sometimes being exuberant, sometimes being too weak, the remedy is pretty easy. It's cooling off the economy when it's too hot, and then going all in when it goes sour, and there's no real trade-off. We are now in a situation that is very different. This is the Fed waking up to this reality over the last 2 years. The crocodile chart that you see here is the Fed, basically their forecast for this year's inflation and growth, as they were envisioning it like 2 years ago, and now it has evolved over time. So as you can see, they've increased their view of inflation from something that looked like 2 back then to more like 4 now. And they are slowly now expecting something that is close to a recession in the US. So that is the hard trade-off in action. That is the world that we think is with us now. This is the end of the Great Moderation. Policymakers face much harder choices. You cannot stabilize both inflation and growth at the same time. You need to pick and choose. And what is behind that? Demographics. Demographics is that's a consequence of the demographics environment we're in. Demographic is creating a very tight labor market. There's less room to be able to buffer, changes in activity through a labor market. And as you can see here on the left-hand side chart, this is for the US because this is where it's the most stark. But the yellow line shows you where the labor market participation should be in the US just based on demographics and where we are now on the red line. And the point I'm trying to put forward here is that there's been a big shock, the pandemic and so on, but the red line hasn't recovered in terms of where we were pre-pandemic, and it's likely not to recover because demographic would have taken us there. And so in the US, we have a very tight labor market, not because the economy is overheating, because there are not enough people now that can work and take those jobs. And so this is a feature of not a healthy labor market, but one that is heavily constrained. That is what's creating the inflationary pressures that are harder and the harder trade-off to navigate. Next slide. We have seen, and I'm going to just drive now to the conclusion of what it means in terms of Canada and the demographics more precisely. Of course, Japan has been the example of a country that has been aging on a faster scale and sooner. That has been happening for some time now. And, we've seen what has happened in Japan now. So this is GDP per capita. This is average income per people in Japan. In the context where they start to really age and feel the aging impact in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And the consequences of it is we've seen that Japan has had many lost decades, very weak growth, and we've seen, basically GDP per capita slowing. And, if we were looking at bigger perspective, basically flatlining compared to the fast growth that Japan had been experiencing before. Now, even though they've been kind of maintaining their standard of living, they haven't been able to continue to increase them, but they have maintained their standard of living. That has required a very significant adaptation in Japan. And this is what I just want to illustrate here with these few slides here. we see that the population first, the population decline that you can see from the first chart with the pink line, so very steady decline. But in terms of total hours work in Japan, the yellow line, what you can see here is that they managed at some point to stop the decline in hours worked. So we see the yellow line flatlining. How is that possible? Well, the three other charts are telling the story. It required adaptation. The first is we've seen, first of all, an increase in the labor force participation. So population has been declining, but more of that population has been entering the labor force or stayed in the labor force longer. How was that achieved? We've seen the retirement age in Japan increase, so that's been one margin of adjustment. And the other is women entering the labor force has been another key driver of this. And immigration has played a role, but a more muted role. This has allowed Japan not to continue on the trajectory that it was, but to basically sustain standard of livings, and these are very significant and material adjustments that were needed. In looking now more closer to home and what it means comparing to Canada, what you have on this chart, way too small for you to read, and I realized, which means we're going back to the impressionistic version of this. What you would see with some telescope is that Japan here, and I would basically focus on the last of these charts, this is the dependency ratio. So this is the fraction of old age population as a fraction of the working age population. They're trending up. What is important is that the purple line, the one that is at the bottom there, is Japan. Japan was way early in getting in a bad situation, but the point is that it continues to be at the top of bad outcomes in terms of aging. So Japan is at the very top of these lines, even going forward. The U.S. is the one that is bending going forward. So the U.S. and the red one is Canada. So we are not in as bad a situation as Japan, even in the past or going forward. So that is a good news. That gives us an advantage. We're not as good as the U.S. is, but from here onward, things get more challenging. So these lines are going up, and that's the important things. We haven't really dealt with that situation. It's coming. So these challenges, this is the Canadian line. So this is the dependency ratio, evolution over time. The positive or above the zero line means that we have a higher dependency on the workforce going forward. And what it means in particular, just to put some numbers, not a forecast, but just to understand the quantum of the things of the forces at play here. To maintain the standard of living we currently have, output per head would have to increase to be 7% higher by 2050. That is about $8,000 per person increase currently compared to where we are now. So that's one way you could, stop the impact of aging population on or maintaining the standard of livings. Another way to achieve that, again, not a forecast, but to give you a sense of the magnitude needed, we would need the retirement age to raise possibly by 3 years to maintain the standard of livings. That's another margin of adjustment. That's the quantum that would be needed. Or we would need to have the working age population increase its spending per dependent by 35%. So that's kind of what the dependency ratio means in terms of, that means spending 35% more for those that are working on supporting the aging population. So these are sizable, big, numbers. Another way to achieve that, which I had in my speech in 2012, was that if we could go back to the average productivity level that we had in Canada between 1970, 1980, and 1990, before the decline, if we could go back to that productivity growth, we would be able to maintain our standard of living as well. So we've seen that in the past. It's possible, but it's far from where we are right now. Migration has been clearly playing a huge role in many countries. And you see here, Canada is the first chart. without migration, we would be on the yellow line in terms of population from here. So we've seen growth in population. We haven't seen the headwinds yet, but it's largely because of immigration so far. And you can see what it means for other countries here. And the U.S. is kind of similar to Canada. The U.S. is the last chart here. I've shown you that in Japan, some of the margin of adjustment were to raise participation in the labor market. So that's a margin of adjustment. I think the good and bad news here is that the good news is that Canada is doing pretty well in terms of labor force participation. We're kind of at the top of these lines in these charts. So if you look, labor force participation 18 and over, the top line, the first chart is Canada. And then you have like the 18 to 64 is the second panel. Canada is up there. One place where, so that's good news, we're up there. The bad news means that we've already used that margin to some extent. So that won't be necessarily the place to make some massive adjustment going forward. One place where we have more room to play is the labor force participation of 60 years old and over. Japan is the pink line on the top. So there's a lot more participation in Japan from 65 years and older. The red line is Canada. So that's one place where there's some margin, but the other pieces seem to be already at the top of some of our peers. I'm running out of time, so this was just digging a bit deeper on some of these forces for Canada and how important migration flows have been so far as a factor. Something that we probably know well, but even during the pandemic, Canada now fares well in terms of labor force participation and population, but demographic has been a very big role. To conclude, I just want to make 2 or 3 points. Without adaptation, the ongoing limits to growth will be very significant. This is happening now in a world that is a lot more challenging than it was in 2012. We won't have central banks being able to support growth as easily as they have in the past because they're going to have the inflation trade-off that's going to be much more acute and will prevent them from being able to have an easing bias like they've had for 40 years effectively. Moreover, the other big part of the story is the pressure on fiscal policy and on debt. These rates adjustment that we are seeing in this higher rate environment that we're in with higher inflation has very significant implication on the debt sustainability going forward. And what you have here is for the U.S. On the left-hand side, but I think it's a tale that is pretty telling. What you have is in red is the forecasted impact of demographic for the U.S. debt in 2029 at the bottom line compared to what it was, let's say, in 1969 at the very top. So you see how much more we're going to have to just support demographic from a fiscal perspective. Green and yellow are fiscal spending in yellow and, defense spending, which is becoming something that will be difficult to avoid given this environment. And the yellow and the green, is the debt of servicing of the debt within this higher rate environment is going to be a bigger account. So very last word here. Demographic is a big challenge that was laying in plain sight already 11 years ago. That hasn't changed. There for everyone to see. That was a diagnostic 11 years ago for me. I think that's a lot of what is behind the initiative of the report we have today. This makes the environment has changed very meaningfully, and I think we're in a new regime, completely different than the last 40 years. That's going to be persistent for the reason I've talked about. That makes the challenge bigger and the need to adapt more urgent. And I would say this is a global phenomenon, pretty clearly, which means that contrary to Japan, we won't have the benefit of a growing global economy on the side that can lift us. So I think the challenge could be even more important for us. So I think the urgency is there. And one thing that this report makes clear, we need to track things to see if we're on track. And the productivity assessment, this report, I think is concerning, given what we've talked about here. But I'll stop it here. I've abused of my time. I'll put it on the impressionistic chart that has distracted me a bit. And I will invite Mark Wiseman now to conduct this interview next.
Merci, Jean. Thank you, Jean. I liked your charts better when we couldn't see the axes. I thought it was a graph of the Toronto Maple Leafs playoff history going down. In any event, thank you again, Jean, and thank you to everyone both here in the room and watching online of this fantastic event. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Wiseman. I am the chair of the board of the Century Initiative. I'm also chair of the board of the Alberta Investment Management Corporation. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure today to initiate a conversation with the Honourable Navdeep Baines, the former Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. Mr. Baines was most recently Vice Chair of Global Investment Banking at CIBC, and he has recently been named as the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer for Rogers Communications. So with no further ado, Navdeep.
So if you don't mind me asking on a personal note, hope everything's okay. That seems pretty serious.
It's my Achilles heel. I have more than one of them. But first of all, thank you for being here. I know that we're supposed to talk about labor force and immigration, but given your new role, I wanted to ask the question that everybody in this room really wants to know about, and that is roaming charges.
It's a great question. Prices will be coming down.
We heard that, right? Look, I think, you know, as the former minister in the government, obviously you dealt with a lot of the issues that we've talked about today. But there really are some significant risks, in all seriousness, facing Canada's labor markets. And, you know, we've heard from Jean what some of the solutions may be. It was interesting that he talked about increasing the retirement age. President Macron has had a very successful run at that policy in France. But from a policy point of view, and I know you're no longer in the government, but what are the options that are available to not just the federal government, but governments writ large in Canada today to address the issues that are facing and will continue to face labor markets?
Well, thank you, Mark, and I appreciate the question, and great to be here. A lot of familiar faces and some new faces as well. But the question you ask from a policy perspective reminds me of a conversation I've had on a number of occasions with the former Prime Minister of Canada, who was very kind to make me take me under his wings and had a really long-term outlook. And I'm talking about Paul Martin, the Right Honourable Paul Martin. And I mention it because he was so focused on this issue about where Canada's going to be. How are you going to be a strong middle power? How are you going to get to 100 million people? How thoughtful we're going to be about it. And for him, one of the key aspects was identifying not only immigration as a unique opportunity, which we'll speak to, but our Indigenous population. It's one of the fastest growing populations in Canada. It's one of the youngest in terms of a segment in our population. So enormous potential. So Mr. Martin has invested a lot of his time post-politics in supporting, particularly at the high school level, setting up Indigenous youth to succeed in whatever career path they want to follow. So I think if you look at it from a workforce perspective, and we're going to talk about upskilling and reskilling, we're talking about immigration, it's really critical to look at the potential of the Indigenous population within Canada. And if we make the right investments, we're in a really unique position to help deal with some of the challenges around the demographic issues raised around an aging population that was highlighted by Jean.
Well, look, I think it's a great point, and I think it's important that we understand that the challenges to the workforce aren't just about immigration. They're not actually just about population growth.
Correct.
We know that increasing workforce participation helps, but population growth is obviously a big part of it. Part of population growth is simply having larger families. I don't think we can legislate that. But we can make it easier for those that want to have larger families to have larger families. But obviously, that alone is not going to get us to where we need to be in terms of what Jean showed, which is this dependency ratio that is literally the crushing weight of the dependency ratio on our ability to kind of provide the type of social safety net and services that we've come to expect in a country like Canada. So talk about immigration a little bit in terms of your view on how that fits in to the solution of sort of future-proofing the Canadian economy.
So it's a bit counterintuitive to what you just said, because you're talking about an aging population. We have more people over the age of 65 than we do under the age of 15, and that trend's going to continue. And in different parts of the country as well. When I was a minister, I would travel to Atlantic Canada, and those issues were more pronounced, and also in rural communities as well. And I would say that, just speaking on my own personal experience, what's so unique in Canada and what differentiates us in terms of our ability to attract talent globally is the fact that we put emphasis on family reunification. And I think that part of the equation is going to be important. I mean, again, understanding that we have a broader challenge around the pressure we're putting on our healthcare system, on housing and all the other social services that we want to maintain or enhance. And I give my own personal example of why this is so important, and family reunification is such a critical part to our immigration story. My dad came here in 1972, $5 to his name, and he learned the cabinetry business from his Italian friends, who called him Vincenzo, by the way, not Balvinder. It was too complicated. And Vincenzo wanted to, just like any other entrepreneur, was really excited about starting his own business. But the first few years were tough. You're not going to make money the first few years. And we can relate to this if we started our own business or if we know someone. And so he needed to work for 2 years. And therefore, my mom, who stayed at home, all of a sudden said, I'll find a job. And she was able to do that. And the reason she was able to do that and support my father in helping him start the business is because grandma and grandpa were at home to take care of me. And so that's where the family reunification all of a sudden made a significant difference. And I know we talk about childcare today and how important that is, but we know there's challenges with, again, labor issues in that particular sector as well. So again, when it comes to immigration in Canada, we talk about international students, we talk about a skilled workforce, but I would emphasize the importance of family reunification because it does have an impact. I give my own example, but I hear this story consistently across the board in terms of just higher income levels for family because they can get twice the income level, in terms of childcare, as I mentioned, and just the family cohesion and better integration is so critical.
So that makes a lot of sense to me, but let me push you on that topic a little bit because obviously that's a very logical argument, and not only is it a logical argument, but it's a humanitarian argument as well. But what's clear when you look at the numbers is that we need more, in addition, it doesn't have to be an or, but we need more young people in this country. And our government has been reasonably slow at bringing young people in particular into the country. So for example, I would personally advocate that any foreign student who comes to Canada and completes a post-secondary degree in one of our 2 official languages, that student should be given a clear path to permanent residency. Because young people, educated, they've shown a commitment to the country by being here and studying. They obviously speak one of the 2 official languages.
That's right.
Why aren't we just giving those people direct access to become permanent residents?
So I think those pathways exist, but there's another issue that I want to just build on. So I think you raise a good point, which is foreign credentials. This is a significant issue. We hear this story often about, if you're in a cab, you speak to the cab driver, he or she has a PhD or a master's, and this is a constant story you hear across the country, no matter what region you're in. And I would say the issue around foreign credentials is an important one. And Rhonda is here, so I'm going to put her on the spot. But when we do bring people, so you talk about international students, and there should be a clear pathway for them. I've talked about the importance of family unification. But sometimes we bring people here and there's a mismatch between the jobs that exist and the skills that they have, or if they have got the skills, their credentials are not recognized. So if they are part of an upskilling or reskilling initiative where they can get quick, rapid, certification, they can quickly integrate. So that's the key part. I think bringing people over is not an issue. We have record number in terms of students. It's about, can they find meaningful employment that meets their skill sets? Because the job vacancies that we have in Canada represent a $30 billion loss to our economy on an annual basis, right? Because these jobs need to be filled. The people are here, the skills aren't there. So that mismatch is important. So I think, for example, the work that Rhonda is doing at Palette is a great way to help Canadians who are reskilling and upskilling, particularly people in mid-career, but also when it comes to international students or people, like, for example, when I say family reunification, I'm not just talking about parents or grandparents. Sometimes you have people in their 40s or 50s that are dealing with an international student that's invited them over. They can be reskilled and contribute to the economy as well.
So let me ask this question. When I travel around the world, as do you, people often talk about Canada as being open and accepting and so on and so forth. And I actually think the polling numbers and indeed the work that we've done in the Century Initiative scorecard shows that Canada not only tends to be, but continues to be one of the most welcoming and integrating countries, if not the most welcoming and integrating countries in the world. But there's still a perception among some, and maybe a fair perception at times, that immigrants create issues in the country. I don't mean issues around crime, but I mean issues around pressure on housing, pressures on public transit, pressures on education and healthcare. How do we, at one hand, deal with the long-term problems that Jean talked about, and at the same time address the short-term exigencies that we're facing as a country, particularly in our cities, around things like housing? I know we're going to hear from Minister Hussain a little bit later, but how do we balance those two things?
So it's a real issue. People are talking about this. I hear these stories often in family conversations, talking to my friends, talking to my coworkers. So these issues do exist. People are like, yeah, it's nice to have higher levels of immigration, but affordability is an issue. My kids can't afford a home. And so they talk about supply, and inevitably there's a finger that's pointed in the direction of newcomers, right? And so that's a real issue. And one of the ways to look at it when I was a minister is how you frame the conversation. So when I was responsible for building the technology ecosystem in Canada, particularly in 2015 when I became a minister, we had this unique opportunity with Brexit and what that meant for people that wanted to go to the UK, and with Donald Trump being elected in the US and what that meant for, again, top tier talent going to the US and how they felt. To your point about Canada's brand, we've had this in the report shows in the Century Initiative that we're right behind Germany and Japan when it comes to our brand. So we had this really strong brand and this unique opportunity. And so we created this skills program called the Global Skills Strategy to enable people to come to Canada within 2 weeks. So pretty cool, pretty impressive. But again, people were pushing back saying, well, why not support, again, local talent coming out of our universities and colleges? They're having difficulty finding a job. I mean, the unemployment rate was 7.5% then. Obviously, it's a tighter labor market now, but at that moment, that was a bit of an issue. And the way I framed the conversation was to say, look, for every one visa that we issue for a newcomer, it creates 10 Canadian jobs. That's jobs for your kids, that's jobs for your neighbors, that's jobs for your friends. And when you frame it that way, people understand. And so it just depends on how we frame the conversation. So again, when it comes to housing, when it comes to social services, we have to find ways of reframing the conversation.
Now, I want to sort of, ask you to maybe take a different approach to it, because you're a glutton for punishment. You were a minister of the Crown.
Yep.
Then you became a Bay Street banker, and now you're working for a big telecommunications company. So you just must want to be loved, right? But I do have a question now with your corporate hat on, whether it's CIBC or Rogers or one of the many other private enterprises in this country. What is the role of business in all this? It's very easy to point the finger at government and say, the government needs to do this, the government needs to do that, it's not doing enough of these things. But business has a role as well. And I've talked quite a bit about the productivity gap in Canada and the lack of R&D spending by business. But business has a role in workforce as well. what do you think the responsibility of business is, and what does Canadian business have to do better?
So you're right about R&D and productivity. These are issues that have been around, as Jean mentioned, since 1990, and it's been a persistent problem for us for a number of decades. I try to address this issue as well in many ways through the Innovation and Skills Plan that I put forward close to a decade ago. And I would say when it comes to larger enterprises in Canada, again, it's not that they're not investing more. They are. But relative to the global peers, they're still falling further behind. So it's important to look at that number, that OECD number that we've seen in the report, as where Canada stands in terms of investments by businesses, particularly large businesses in research and development. The number is going up, but companies in other jurisdictions are investing more. And so I think we're falling behind there, and that's a real challenge. And it's a function of just being close to the US, I think. Part of it is just easy to adopt technology off the shelf or initiatives that are in the US and adopt into Canada. So there's the risk averseness that Canada has, large corporations have, and so to unlock that is being a bit of a challenge. But I think where the unique opportunity lies on the productivity side of it is with our smaller businesses, our smaller to medium-sized enterprises. You know, the two things that are going to transform our economy and the global economy in the coming decades is the energy transition that we just talked about, and what that means in terms of the trillions of dollars that are going to be invested and the opportunities that's going to create, and the digital transformation that's taking place. And for our smaller and medium-sized enterprises, particularly around the digital transformation, they're investing only 50 cents of the dollar in the US when it comes to investments in ICT. So that's where I think the gap lies. It's those investments and the reluctance that exists by smaller businesses to invest. So governments have done some work, but ultimately businesses need to do more. To your point, it's not only about attracting talent to Canada, how do we retain them, right? And I think that's a key issue.
Can I push you just one step further on that, on the follow-up? I mean, a lot of people think about productivity as being investment in physical capital. You know, let's build better equipment or a better plant. But I happen to believe that productivity has a lot to do with human capital as well. And so is Canadian business doing enough to skill and reskill its workforce to be in tune with what's required in this century and beyond?
So the short answer is no. Again, relative to our international peers, we're not. And you're absolutely right. If you look at the valuations of companies, 90% of their valuations are associated with intangible assets. So we get so caught up with some of the traditional ways of looking at assets and the investments that we make in individuals to improve productivity. So the skills agenda is so critical. And going back to my earlier point, the plan that I put forward for industrial policy was called Innovation and Skills. You cannot succeed as a society if you don't make those investments in the skills area. And that's really our industrial policy. I know we get captured, and rightfully so, by conversations around the subsidy that Volkswagen's received, or what Stellantis wants now, or the amount of money we're investing in direct air capture, or carbon capture, sequestration out west. Those are great technologies, but it's really the opportunity and the risk for us is on the skill side of it, in terms of our ability to attract people, retain people, and as you say, improve our productivity.
I'm going to ask you one last question. I know we're out of time.
That's why I was trying to be concise.
This will be the last one before the break. You've now been outside of government for a period of time. You've lived now in the private sector, into government, back in the private sector. If you had one piece of advice to give your former colleagues around the cabinet table today, what would it be?
Oh, the race is on. The race is on for all the issues we've discussed. And you know, as we discuss and talk about these issues around the skills agenda, around productivity, around immigration, we've had some structural advantages in the past. We've had some geopolitical issues that have lined up for us. But the dynamic has shifted enormously. And if we don't act with a great deal of urgency and ambition, we'll miss out. And this will impact our quality of life. And that's what fundamentally it boils down to. I left politics to spend more time with my girls, and I think about them a lot, and I think about the world that they're going to grow up in, and I think about some of the challenges they have around their quality of life, and it's very much connected to the issues we talked about today.
Navdeep Baines, thank you.
Thank you.
We will now take about a 10-minute break and welcome everybody back here at 15 minutes after the hour.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. So we'll just wait for a second for the last remaining people to make their way back to the room. We invite you back in. I'm Rita Tritcher. I'm a senior business writer and columnist with the Globe and Mail, and I am very, very pleased to be your moderator for the next discussion. It is a panel discussion focused on solutions to close some of the labor gaps that were discussed earlier, especially in sectors such as healthcare and the digital economy. So let's introduce our panelists. First up, we have AJ Tabando, Chief Strategy Officer with Palette Skills. AJ, come on up. Next up, we have Murali Srinarayanathas, who is CEO of 369 Global Inc. Murali. And joining us virtually is Dr. Lika Lafontaine, President of the Canadian Medical Association. And last, but certainly not least, we have Pedro Barata, Executive Director of the Future Skills Center. On stage here. We're going to jump right in. I'd like to start by asking each of you about your work related to closing labor gaps or building strong workforces in Canada. So we're going to do a round. AJ, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, yeah. So thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So at Palette Skills, my organization, we are a national nonprofit that works with industry to develop new pools of talent to help fill high demand roles in growing fields. And we do this by building upskilling programs that center employers at the heart of them to understand what is the talent that you're looking for, what are the skills that you need, what are the characteristics of the people that you want to be working with, and how can we as quickly as possible take people from one side of the labor market where they might be in disrupted or fast changing industries and upskill them and move them into new high growth careers. We look at this problem from the perspective of talent utilization. So asking the question, how can Canada, with one of the most highly skilled workforces in the OECD, still consistently struggle to find skilled talent for these high demand jobs? And similar to the panelists previously, Mark and Minister Baines, it's really about how we use the talent that we have and how quickly and easily we can adopt and adapt new pathways to help people move into these high demand jobs. So that's really what we look at. We build programs to actually do that. And we were just the recipients of an investment from the federal government for $250 million to scale this approach nationally across the country. Which we'll be doing over the next couple of years, putting, again, industry at the heart of the solution and building the new pathways to help move that mobility, or that labor mobility.
That's fantastic. Murali, you're up next. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Great, thank you. At 369 Global, we focus on education and communication and business consulting. If we think about individuals coming to Canada, we focus on the education aspect, helping them upskill for opportunities here in Canada. We also assist businesses coming in as foreign direct investment, understanding the Canadian market. Typically, it's more diverse than some of the countries that folks are coming from. But we also help SMEs scale globally. I think we know there's a tremendous pool of talent here in terms of businesses and individuals in Canada, and it's really the people at the end of the day. There's Ukrainian Canadians, Vietnamese Canadians, and tapping into this pool of talent to access the global markets is where 369 Global focuses on.
Okay, we're going to go to Alika, who's joining us virtually.
Yeah, great to join you guys virtually. I imagine I'm a giant disembodied head in the room right now, but I'm president of the Medical Association, national voice of Canada's 90,000 plus physicians. We focus on advocacy for change in the healthcare system. And when it comes to the workforce, I think this last budget actually saw most of the changes that we've been advocating for the past couple of years. It's the largest non-investment of the federal government all the way back to the 2000 health accords when they first started this type of transfer. We're creating a Center for Health Human Workforce that is going to be housed over at Kai, which is a first in Canada. And I'm really hoping in coming years we're going to move beyond just this standard non-nuanced head count of how we go tracking our physician and health worker workforce across the country, so we can get more nuanced and actually deal with the major problem of why people are leaving healthcare, which is just very poor working environments.
Okay, and Pedro, last but not least.
Again, hi everyone. We're an applied research center. Over the past 3.5 years, we've established over 200 partnerships with all kinds of organizations, from employers to sectors to post-secondary institutions. And we're essentially trying to stretch the horizon for how we do skills development in Canada. It tends to be very much focused on today's problems in the here and now, and try to create some space within our workforce development system to think into the future. Right now, we're in every region, just about every sector. Some of the issues that we're really leaning into include the shift to carbon neutral, and doing work on the ground in places like BC, looking at mass timber, looking at plant proteins in the prairies, and also, of course, batteries in southern Ontario. And really getting into the crunchiness of not just what are the skills that we're going to need in our workforce, but how are we going to get everybody working differently to do better forecasting of what scenarios we'll be looking at. And then to work backwards and figure out how is it that we all need to work differently to create the pathways that people and employers are going to need so that everybody succeeds, so that we maximize our workforce, so that we build a cleaner, more productive future.
Okay, so I'm going to just continue with you for a second. What would you say is the top challenge when connecting employees to the workforce?
There are many. One that was mentioned in the last panel is actually the challenge and opportunities with small medium enterprises. Canada has a very unique profile compared to our neighbors in the south in terms of the number of private sector jobs that come from SMEs. As we all know, over 90%. As the world continues to change, we need to lift up our literacy around things like inclusion among SMEs, around climate literacy. As we all know, AI is coming, and it's not going to be just the cool kids playing with it. It has to be everybody. So how is it that we actually create platforms that recognize that SMEs face all of the perennial issues that we know about around lack of bandwidth, lack of resources, lack of scale, and actually start to create the platforms that are going to give curated opportunities that are really informed by SMEs themselves about like what they say they want, what they say they will use, and then testing that to see if there are actual moments of truth. And if we can create those platforms, if we can create more of that infrastructure, it's actually what we're going to need to help our SMEs take advantage of all the opportunities and change that's coming our way.
That's a great point. Alika, I want to get your perspective on the top challenge when connecting employees to the workforce. I mean, you're coming at it from being the president of the Canadian Medical Association. What do you see as the top challenge?
So I think the transition that's happened in healthcare is very similar to other fields across the country. And I think the challenge that we're trying to address is not the challenge that we actually need to address. So in the past, it's always been, how can you get the most productivity out of your workforce? How can you move things down the chain so that more people kind of fill those sorts of roles? Our major problem with healthcare right now is actually hypermobility of people across the country and across the world. So we have to start to consolidate the way that we track healthcare workers in particular. In the past, we've always depended on people only working in one province or jurisdiction for their whole career. You're regularly seeing now when people are frustrated with the workplace, they are actually getting up and moving, sometimes to a different province or territory or down into the States. If you look worldwide at the numbers of physicians and their mobility, you know, more than a quarter of physicians have worked in more than one country over the past couple of years, which is way higher than we've ever seen before. And so we're starting to see a higher level of competitiveness. And just related to that AI comment, I think what you're starting to see as well is that people's ability to work and be mobile across different types of work is starting to shift, true in healthcare as well.
Okay, AJ, what say you about the top challenge
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Pedro said about SMEs, because I think that this is a really important, part of the story, is that Canada is a country of SMEs. That is where the growth of our jobs happens. It's where the growth of our businesses happen. And so if we don't understand how to really serve SMEs when it comes to their needs, we're missing a big part of the equation. I think to take a bit of a different tact on it, from my perspective, we have a tremendous, to put in business terms, we have tremendous production capacity in this country when it comes to skilled workers. We have an incredible education system, an incredible post-secondary education system, an immigration system that prioritizes skilled workers. So we have a tremendous amount of skilled talent here. What we struggle with is a strong go-to-market strategy of how to connect that talent into the customers, the companies that are looking for it. And I think we've historically made the assumption that, if we build it, they will come. That, if you just pump a lot of good graduates in certain programs out of school, they will get hired. And what we know with SMEs particularly, that may be true for larger corporates who have a big, a bigger risk tolerance for trying new things or just bringing on workers they might not be as certain about. In SMEs, the impact, if you make one risky hire and you're a 50-person company, the impact of that hire on your company, if it doesn't work out, is significantly bigger than if you're a 5,000-person company or 50,000-person company. So understanding risk, understanding how companies evaluate talent, what they're looking for, what they're afraid of, these are all considerations that we need to understand as we're building these intermediary solutions to help SMEs get this talent. And so I think that we have built a big production capacity, and now it's time to really think about how do we take everything that we have and move it across the labor market into the places that need it in real time.
And Murali, what about you? What do you see as the top challenge?
Yeah, I think I'll give a practical example from one of our companies, Rita. At Computech, we educate 35 to 45 in terms of age demographic. 75% of our student base are women, and we cater to all immigrants. In our cybersecurity program, as an example, 45% of the graduates are women. And they're getting certifications from Cisco, Microsoft, you name it, along with their diploma. The challenge we have is getting employment for that 45%, for those women, because the companies are not catering to those women, and it's specifically immigrant women. So for us, it's education and communication for those businesses. That's the challenge. The immigrants are doing the hard work and getting skilled, but they're looking for those opportunities where companies are catering to their skills and their backgrounds. And I think education and communication is the key.
Okay, we really want to make this a solutions-driven conversation, which is so important because it's practical advice for everybody either listening online or here in person. Pedro, I want to start with you. We know that labor shortages are affecting many industries. So what do you see as some of the solutions that will help prepare Canada's workforce for both the current and future challenges?
I think one of the areas that we really need to take seriously is inclusion, and we've talked about that already today. As we increasingly rely on newcomers, and also a true believer in turning up that tap in terms of the number of newcomers, we're going to have an increasingly diversified workforce. And back to the issues around SMEs. How is it that we actually build inclusion literacy among SMEs to not just hire somebody, but to actually retain them and keep them and make sure that, that you create a welcoming workplace. This is not, simply about doing the right thing. It's actually about doing the smart thing. And it's one of the areas that we have started in terms of our work with SMEs in 4 provinces, working with chambers of commerce, trying to actually create infrastructure on the ground that can work directly with employers to figure out what's the challenge, what will be the take-up in terms of new tools, what will be required in terms of technical assistance or capacity building, and then how is it that if it works, and we start to see that there's a diversity quotient that starts to go up, that leads to better outcomes for SMEs, how is it that we continue to leverage that approach to then ask questions around climate literacy and the supply chain issues that SMEs are going to have to take advantage of. How is it that SMEs actually take advantage and become part of the conversation on AI and don't feel just completely left behind? So those solutions on the ground are quite key because we have to go to where business owners actually are, and we have to take the time to test models directly with people and then to go back and see if they work, right? And have rigorous evaluation, rigorous measurement so that we're building and scaling out platforms that are based on not just good guesses and good ideas, but actual data and evidence about what works.
Okay, so go to where the business owners are and measure, measure, measure. This is great. Okay, Alika, I want to ask you about the healthcare sector in particular. Obviously, we've come out of a global pandemic with COVID-19, and how pressing now that we are at this stage are the labor and skill shortages in the healthcare sector, and what are the impacts?
So things are quite dire. And I think in the course of just the way that the news cycle works, people have moved on to some degree from the crisis that's currently happening across Canada. You're still seeing shutdowns of ERs. You are still seeing daily shutdowns of ORs across the country because of lack of nurses or lack of physicians or, lack of other skilled personnel that help with setting up or cleaning or other things within hospitals. You're going to see the primary care crisis get a lot worse if we don't start to do something different. Now, the real question is well, what's the solution?
Yes.
And I'm just going to touch on something that Morale just talked about. And I think the solution is actually the same, even though it seems like they're two different problems. So in healthcare, we have a really hard time knowing where our skilled personnel are because they have lots of options for where to go for. On the other side, we have a lot of skilled international folks who have been trained in healthcare who are not able to access work. And if you look at Stats Canada, I believe the latest statistic was 2 in 5 healthcare workers in the country who are healthcare providers in other countries actually aren't employed in the area of the healthcare field. Now, the solution to that is actually defragmentation of the market. We need to consolidate all these different silos that we have across the country, all these different locations where we're storing information. This is one of the reasons why we were so excited about the Center for Health Force. And we have to dig deep so we do more than just headcounts. I've seen multiple different ways of collecting family physician numbers. One of the lists had Chris Hadfield on it while he was in space. I mean, you can't provide, well, I guess you could do virtual care, but you can't provide healthcare in the course of being off planet. So I think that the solution is for provinces and territories to actually lean into these agreements that we signed years ago about helping workforce be more mobile across the country. And we have to see coordination, collaboration in data sets, and also dig down deep so we can have people matched to opportunities that not only meet their skill sets, but also what they want to get out of their job.
Okay, Morale, I want to talk to you a bit about immigrants because that's your focus. What are some of the strategies that you see that could help better connect newcomers to good jobs and careers in Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Rita. We have a big focus on the education aspect, of course, and it's finding the right skills that match with the employer's needs. At 369 Global, we're taking a big focus on the healthcare sector. The feedback that we've been getting from immigrants that are coming to Canada, IRCC put out stats that it used to be 8 out of 10 newcomers would come to Canada to become citizens. It's now 4 out of 10. So clearly there's things that we're missing. And I think one of the biggest sectors that we should be focusing on as a group at 369 Global is healthcare. Practically, again, I like to keep it practical, Rita, but I had a gentleman that was a phenomenal candidate for us as a group who joined us, and then one of his kids who was born in Canada became sick. He couldn't have access to a GP, and when they went to the emergency room, waited for several hours, and then decided to move back to India because this wasn't the place, because it's not just about him, it's about his child. So we're very much focused on healthcare and healthcare opportunities. So we do a big focus there in terms of education and providing upskilling in that sector.
Okay, my parents still wish I had focused on healthcare. There you go. AJ, it's enough of a challenge to find employees for today's jobs, but we also need to keep an eye on the future. So I want you to cast forward. What skills or knowledge will be most important a few years down the road?
I mean, I knew you were going to ask me this question. I spent all weekend trying to figure out how to answer it. Because I think that if we've learned anything in the last couple of years, it's that the world is now moving faster than our ability to predict with any kind of certainty what's going to happen. And, again, I'll plug our approach, which is that the change is now so fast, it's so constant, and new opportunities and needs are cropping up seemingly overnight. I think the solution is not to necessarily bet on certain jobs, but to create a system that can respond to those needs as they emerge in real time. And that's certainly what we're trying to do with Upskill Canada. And what that requires is having industry right beside training providers and education services working together in tandem to build those upskilling pathways that are focused on jobs. That's not just about teaching somebody new skills, which is vital, but it's how do you take those skills and translate them all the way into that employment outcome, which is, for us, a job is the expression of a satisfied market. Job seekers fulfilled their needs, and the employer has fulfilled their need. And so that's really what we look at. But I'd say, if there were a couple areas that jump out in my mind, we have talked for the past decade about this looming AI revolution, and when it comes, that it's not going to be just technologists that we need to understand how to navigate AI. It's going to be social scientists and liberal arts students and people, and those skills, those human skills of really understanding how humans behave in society, how they are incentivized and motivated and demotivated, and unintended consequences of these big pieces of technology that are real game changers. We need people right beside the engineers and technologists producing that technology, talking about its applicability and what it means for society. And the other thing that I'll say is I think remote work is here to stay. I think that it is, employees are voting with their feet. They want to be able to, if they can work from home to do their job, they want to be able to. And so I think that, as we are adjusting to this new normal, helping managers and leaders develop the skills that they need to manage a remote workforce, I think, is something that we see increasingly. It's a huge challenge. It's a lot to ask of people, and it's a new skill set to learn. And so I think those things, are two areas that I can see just from today, but who knows what happens tomorrow.
I'm going to tell my mom you said that human skills are still going to be valued.
I am the only social scientist on our executive management team of engineers and technologists, and I feel it.
Okay, so Pedro, I'm going to ask you the same question. Look into your crystal ball. What do you see in the future?
Well, in the immediate future, I actually wanted to just point to a sign of hope and give kudos to IRCC and to the federal department that oversees immigration. Not simply because the numbers are going up, because when you listen to the deputy, when you listen to the minister, they mean business in terms of changing the mindset of how immigration has operated in Canada. And they are very explicit in saying that our legislative framework for immigration in Canada for too long has been about keeping people out and managing risk. And that the change that needs to happen is that we actually need to flip that on its head. And we need to be much more welcoming. And that is going to be hard from a change management point of view, because of course you have an entire group of people working in a federal department that have grown up and have developed under a different mindset. But there is a deep, comprehensive review happening right now. Many of you have probably been part of the consultations and discussions that have happened with senior bureaucrats at IRCC. Personally, I'm quite impressed in terms of what we're seeing and in terms of the ambition of the change that needs to happen, and they're not shying away from that, which I think is terrific. Things that should happen that relate to your question in terms of immigration is that right now, if you ask employers, or most employers, what are the most important skills, of course they will say tech, tech, tech. They will also say social emotional skills, of course, because everybody has to be resilient and adaptable and have global competencies and know how to collaborate. But the number one bucket of skills is actually around cognitive, right? And it's just a realization that a lot of the future of work is going to be about how. How are we going to solve this problem? Through critical thinking, through analytics, through creativity. And those are the things that employers are really looking for more and more. Now, what we should be doing in our immigration system, especially when we look at the express entry point system, is not simply ask, what degree do you have? We should actually be much more sophisticated in thinking about what are going to be the industries that are going to be growing in Canada over the next 5 years, what are the common sets of cognitive, technical, and social and emotional skills across those, and how is it that we start to test so that we have a more comprehensive dashboard in terms of welcoming the best talent from around the world, and we also have some pathways in terms of how we can help people grow and adapt so that they can integrate into the labor market faster.
Okay, Morali and Alika, I want you both to weigh in on potential public policy solutions. You go first.
Giving us the toughest questions. Okay. I really appreciated both of the comments before me, and I think the key to tie in both of your comments, I guess, from my perspective, is the diversity. If you think about a lot of things that are lacking in technology, is the diverse perspective, and that comes from immigrants having a voice in key power positions and having a space in policy. And I think the federal government, provincial governments are doing amazing things. But I also think it's very important to have people who have that immigrant perspective leading that policy. I think that's important so any immigrants out there looking for opportunities to run for office, please do so. But yes, I think the governments are doing amazing things in terms of attracting, and innovative things in terms of attracting immigrants. But on the policy angle, to answer your question, Rita, I think it's critical to look at inviting immigrants over, and the credentialing portion is a critical component. Recognizing foreign credentials and finding that smooth pathway for folks to get into these employment opportunities, I think is the biggest thing that we can do to support in terms of policy changes.
Okay, and Alika, I want you also to weigh in on the public policy challenges. Oh, wait,
I hope he's not frozen.
I think he's frozen. Okay.
He's got a good face, though. Good face.
Good
frozen face.
You know what we're going to do then is we'll take a question from someone in the audience. If anybody in the audience has a question for our speakers, we have some runners. Yes, that young woman over here in the blue, yes? Or turquoise, I should say.
Hi, my name is Sue Penny, Price Check. I don't know how many people in this, I have nothing to do with this book other than that I just read it. A book called Crack Up Capitalism. And it explains that there are literally thousands now of regions around the planet where there is capitalism without democracy. And I hear all of the wishes of policies for corporations in Canada to adapt and change and so on. But I do hope that we realize that we are competing with thousands of regions around the world that have no democracy with capitalism. And it's a great book, but while we're putting nooses around the necks of corporations in Canada with policies, I do hope that we realize that we are competing with organizations that don't have democracy.
Okay, did you want to add something quickly to
I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about the scorecard that the Century Initiative actually released today. And there is a piece in it about who are populations and demographics who are at greatest risk of being left behind and being left out of our conversations. And a focus on youth in terms of the ups and downs, cyclical ups and downs of the economy, and how the scarring that leaves on youth who enter into labor markets that are tighter, where they're competing against workers that have more experience, where incidences of mental health begin to impact the long-term range and long-term success of young people who become adult workers, and where that disproportionately impacts racialized workers, or racialized young people as well as women, I think it's a very serious issue. You know, it links to voice, it links to participation, it links to hope, it links to the opportunity to ever think about owning a house, for example, and whether that's even within the realm of possibility. And I think we really, as we continue to go through the ups and downs of the economic cycle, we really have to keep an eye on our younger workforce and make sure that in tighter periods of the labor market, we don't leave them behind, we don't scar them for life, and that we very intentionally invest in ongoing financial security and training for young people through all of our economic cycles.
Okay, Alika, you're back. Excellent. We have about 20 seconds left, but I would like to get your thoughts really quickly on public policy solutions, if you may.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us in the country right now is that the people who can move markets actually end up moving the markets in meaningful ways. And who's the biggest market mover in any field? It's the federal government. It's our provinces and territories. So if we can get all of them gathered around the table working together, and then just like was said by the other panelists, having people who are actually working in the fields that we're trying to impact, providing sage advice, I think we have a lot of hope to actually change things. But if the federal, provincial, territorial partners get up and walk away, I think we're going to see much worse times ahead.
Okay, there's a challenge to the provincial, territorial, and federal governments. Work together. That would be fantastic. We're going to have to leave it there. I would like to thank AJ Morali, Alika, and Pedro for joining us today. But before I hand off to my colleague, I'd like to let everyone know what's still ahead in our program. Following our next panel focused on youth, we will have an interview with the Honorable Ahmed Hussein, Minister of Housing and Inclusion and Diversity. So you're going to want to stick around for that. And to close out, we will have a keynote by internationally acclaimed author Parag Khanna, who has written a book called Move, Where People Are Going for a Better Future. You'll also want to stick around for that. And then, of course, we will have a cocktail reception in our beautiful space outside. Hopefully, you will stay and network a little bit and enjoy the terrace and the gorgeous views. And now, I'm going to hand things over to my esteemed colleague, Sandra Martin. Thank you all. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Rita. As Rita said, I'm Sandra Martin. I'm the head of newsroom development at the Globe and Mail, and I'm really excited to moderate this next discussion, which really talks about development. What can we do for young people who are entering the workforce, either from outside of Canada, they're coming to this country looking for opportunities, or they've come up through the education system here. The pandemic has really derailed plans for youth in Canada, and they face a really uncertain future given the rapid change and the nature of work and the emergence of digital technologies, AI, anyone. So we have a really excellent group to discuss this topic, and I will, without further ado, be introducing them right now. First up, we have Agapi Gassese, who's Executive Director with the C Centre for Young Black Professionals. And joining us all the way from Saskatoon is Ian Stavness, Associate Professor with the Department of Computer Science at the University of Saskatchewan. And next, we have someone who's not a stranger to these talks, Shamira Madhani, who's Managing Director for Canada and Deputy Executive Director of World Education Services. So the clock's already counting down. I want to jump right in because I know we have a lot to talk about. So I want to start by asking each of you to briefly explain the work that you're doing related to youth and skills development. So Agapi.
For sure. So I have the privilege and the honor of serving as the Executive Director at C Centre for Young Black Professionals. And what we do is we focus on workforce development and tackling the social and economic barriers that are facing Black youth across the country. And we do this by looking at where there are labor gaps and training them so we can get them from the back of the unemployment line to hopefully the front or close to it. So thank you.
All right, Ian.
Great, thanks. Well, I'd like to start, since I'm coming from Saskatoon, to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, and I'm just really happy to be here today. At the University of Saskatchewan, we're leading a new graduate student training program in computational agriculture. And this is motivated by trying to capture the $11 billion opportunity that Canada has to accelerate the adoption of technology in agriculture, and particularly data-intensive technology. So we are training students at the intersection of plant science and computer science, and giving them skills and diverse teams that they can operationalize those goals.
All right, thanks. Shamira.
Sure. So World Education Services is a 50-year-old organization. We assess academic credentials. We do about 500,000 each year. And generally, we open doors for individuals, whether they're immigrants, international students, refugees, to either go back to higher education, to get licensed, or to basically go into employment. I need to make a comment around a comment that was made a little bit earlier around the issue of barriers that are faced for academic credentials. We do academic assessments, and we do it really successfully. The issue is really very much about how are those experiences that people bring, how do those experiences move into the Canadian context. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to separate out academic credentials and experience assessment.
Okay, well, let's start with a bird's eye view by talking about the biggest challenges that young people face when they're attempting to access good jobs, so high quality jobs and starting their careers. Why don't we start at the other end? Shamira.
Sure. So I'm going to focus very much on youth, and although we have talked about the gaps in terms of young people not being able to access jobs, the focus is really on refugee and immigrant youth. And one of the issues that we don't really think about in a very intentional way is we think about youth as just a general population. But when you think about immigrant and refugee youth, they have a very different experience. They're either basically children of immigrants who are struggling themselves, or they're refugees where young people have come here, or they might be international students. And so they have very unique experiences in terms of trying to integrate into the labor market. And even if they do, they're basically in really low-paying jobs, and so there is no future. One of the biggest issues for young people and the unique experience that they face, which is a negative experience, is no social capital. So whereas we have, basically children where we can open doors, where we have friends and community, with immigrant and refugee youth, they have nowhere to turn. And so what ends up happening is that they're struggling. So you have basically two generations now struggling. Immigrants and newcomers are highly skilled, and basically their children. And so, for me, these are issues that at World Education Services, we've gone deep into, look at statistics, and then we have some solutions that I could offer as we talk about that.
So these were some of the challenges that were covered in a report that World Education Services released recently called Immigrant Youth in Canada's Labour Market. So we'll come back to that.
Sure.
Ian, what do you see as being some of the largest challenges?
Well, as mentioned in previous panels, we really do feel that international students are a key piece of the puzzle, and we think that these types of training programs that are specialized and set up to really tackle these opportunities that are emerging are really critical to not just bringing international students in and training them in ways, but ensuring that they have a pathway to very successful careers. And we absolutely think that this space of computational agriculture is a really expanding area that we can really attract students to and bring them to Canada for.
Okay, well, more on that. And Agapi, what do you see as being some of the largest challenges?
I definitely think social capital is one of them, and much to just piggyback off of what she was saying, I think that we need to also recognize that people, Black youth specifically, because that's really what I'm representing here on this stage, is the reality is they're first or second generation immigrants. And so that struggle of their parents coming to this country continues on. And there's actually statistics that Census Canada came out with that shows us that the longer we stay here as Black Canadians, the worse off we are becoming. And so it's about social capital, but it's also about exposure and access. Yes, understanding that you can't go to your parents or your cousin or whomever and say, hey, I'm really interested in working in the newsroom. Can you take me there? And it's also just even acknowledging that those jobs exist. I think exposure is like the #1 thing, access is second, and social capital being third.
Something that we've talked about as well in the lead up to this panel is self-exclusion. So I think you kind of touched on that a little bit, and I'll come back to you as well on that, Shamira. What are some steps, like let's get really granular here, that both parents and employers and education organizations can take to reducing that?
Well, when you say self-exclusion, meaning that the young people are kind of
Young people are, and we hear this too sometimes in hiring, that, oh, I don't see myself either at that organization or in that profession, partly because there hasn't been a history of exposure.
Okay, fair enough. I would probably rephrase that for all of us who are using that and not say it's self-exclusion, because it's not out of their own like will of wanting to be excluded. I think it's like an external factor. I think you don't know what you don't know. Just like any of us who go into a new job or a new experience, you don't know what you haven't been exposed to. And I think we need to start thinking about how are we engaging every Canadian and every community in a unique and different way. When we're talking about young people, you can't just have a paintbrush, just like for the Black community. There's people from the Caribbean, there's people from Africa, there's people from the continent. Like, Blackness is not one thing. And so our approach at C has to be different for each community, even within the Black community. Same thing for all Canadians. We need to be having a different approach of how we're engaging, creating exposure, creating social currency for each group if we really want to allow success to flourish, and not use things like, self-exclusion, because they're not excluding themselves. They very much want to be a part of it, and we need to create space for that to happen.
So let's, this is maybe a difficult question in such a general forum, but what is one thing that employers can do that would start us on the path to that?
My favorite question.
Could be more than one.
Yes,
but just looking at the time.
Yes, there's so many things, but I will definitely say #1 is you cannot just put a flag in the middle of a community you have no relationship with and be like, we're hiring, and then when no one shows up, be like, oh, well, I tried and nobody applied, so we did our part. That's not how this works. Anything business, it starts with relationship. You need to build relationship with these communities. Find an organization like C or whatever the equivalent is in that community to be an intermediary to bring those young people in, to work with the employers, to train them up. You cannot diversify a workforce that has no history of anyone, even being trained up in it. If it means you need to have a 15-year plan that takes you to high school students and providing scholarships so that they can enter into it, then that's what you need to do. But you need to have a strategy. You cannot just put, a sign in the middle of a community. It's just not going to work that way.
Yeah, something else, and thank you for that. I think it's really important to have those hard, frank conversations. Shamira, I think you mentioned also the importance of, once you've hired young people, you can't just say, well, that's it, we've done our job. There's more that has to happen. Can you talk about that?
Sure, and that was part of the report. So the first thing, and I'm just building on what Agapi said, is that we can't just basically get into a situation where we'll say, here are the issues and here are the solutions. It has to be for youth, by youth, because they actually know what their issues are, and so it's a matter of getting youth to sit at the table, once you go to the communities. Basically, in terms of, some of the solutions, and, we talk about this with what youth could do and what are the concrete solutions, is work integrated learning. And a lot of the refugee youth and international students are not part of the WILL program that the federal government has funded. And so the way to do that in a very intentional way is when you hire people, you don't have the highest expectations because they haven't had history or a chance. So what you do is you bring people in who at least have the potential. And then once you bring people in, you build a very intentional program, which includes professional development, which includes coaching in terms of professional speaking, and actually putting them into projects where it's coaching and learning and also giving the lived experience. So Sandra, for me, that's actually what works, is that it's not just employers saying we have jobs in your community, it's here's how we are going to support you to move forward. Because if we have the demographic profiles that's changing and you have the vacancies, you have the potential in front of you and use it, but being intentional. So employers need to basically see what's in front of them, invite you to design the program, and actually support them through work integrated learning. And it's going to be highly successful. We've seen that at World Education Services, where we brought young people in. And you know, we had one individual who came through what's called a WUSC program, which is the World University Services, from a refugee camp in Kenya, who basically, you know, came and worked with us, and who I now understand is a policy analyst with Health Canada. Another individual, both the parents are refugees. She's got a great opportunity and is working. She's supporting her parents and she's got skills. So, you know, what I say to all the employers here is let's be intentional, because we're actually changing the lives of a generation.
All right, well, keeping on that theme, Ian, you are working in the field of agriculture, which isn't known for being diverse. So can you tell us about some of the work that you're doing, that your team is doing to change that?
Yeah, sure. You know, so I'll start by saying that, you know, the field of agriculture and the system of agri-food represents a huge part of Canada. 1 in 9 jobs fall into that system. So, you know, it does represent more diversity than what you would commonly perceive. But certainly this training program is purposefully designed to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's structurally done so. So making sure that we have diverse teams. You know, we know the best teams, the most creative teams are the most diverse ones. So we've built that into the system. Representation for Indigenous voices in the governance of these programs is critical and is built into the system. And then maybe I'll take the example from computer science. In my discipline, you know, we've seen tremendous growth in computer science over the past 30 years, like, you know, unbelievable growth. But we know that we've suffered from underrepresentation of women and gender minorities, and we know that, you know, we could be better with their representation. And these sort of programs are hoping to improve that inclusion. So by partnering with plant sciences, for example, which has a strong representation of women, we're giving opportunities for women to participate in data science and computer science in authentic ways. And we know that the program's going to be more successful with that representation.
All right, thank you. Agapi, I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier about communities engaging with an organization like C. Let's blue sky. What would you like to see? So if anyone wanted to connect with you after this chat.
Sure. This is what we're currently doing. And, Willa's in the audience, so perfect timing. What we do is what we call strategic partnerships. We want government, community, ourselves, and corporate Canada to be at the table, and we all want to be mutually benefiting from the relationship. Not one person doing the other a favor, but how can we come to the table and create something that makes sense for all of us and is feeding into each other's needs. So I'll use Cisco as an example. We came to that partnership and said, okay, well, we run a relationship. It started with relationship, and said, okay, well, we have a cybersecurity program, we have a C-Tech program. How can we work together to kind of make this better? But we're also having learning challenges in the midst of COVID. They came in, they made an assessment. We have over $1 million worth of equipment that allowed us to be more interactive, meet the learning needs of our young people. But also we became a Cisco certified organization so that we could certify our young people when they graduate from the program. And then at the end, we have an employer. So we want to be able to create a pipeline together. Like, we bring the people, you bring the expertise, we build something together, we possibly get government or someone to fund it, if not yourself. And how do we create this together and create an ecosystem? However many people you can hire is how many people we'll bring into the program. But at C, we have an 85% retention rate in the entire 10 years of our existence, which means 85% of the young people who come through our doors end up starting a career in the industry that they trained in with us 2 years after they've graduated. So we're not talking about like something that doesn't work here. Like this works, and I think also focusing on the life stabilization of those young people, because our communities are dealing with far more than what is in finding a job. You know, there's young people who are dealing with, you know, homelessness, food insecurity, all of these things. So an organization like C is going to be able to meet those needs for those young people, the mental health needs, the economic needs, so that they can actually focus on their careers and deliver for the employer that's at the table. So it's really an ecosystem that needs to be created, if all was great. So you can definitely talk to me later.
All right, Shamira, a similar question for you. What solutions are you working on with World Education Services going forward?
Sure. So actually 3 recommendations that I would like to make for those who are in government or are listening is the need for providing settlement services for international students. 860,000 work permits or study permits last year, and they have no access to settlement services. So that's something that I think is really important, and we're basically making recommendations to government and then having conversations with different organizations. The second is work integrated learning, and so making sure that young people, refugees and youth have access to work integrated learning, co-op programs where they actually get paid. Because many of these young people are working at 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. So it doesn't make sense to bring them into an internship program. They won't succeed. So work integrated learning that's paid. And then finally, just making sure that employers work with the young people to design programs that are going to support them to succeed, rather than here's a program, you know, I hope you do well. So those are the 3 concrete solutions.
Yeah, the idea of the work integrated programs, you know, for an organization, an employer that's looking to invest in a program that would really make a difference. Something that, you know, when I've taught, I've heard again and again is, you know, $1,000 a year in a scholarship is helpful, but it actually might not, it's probably not as helpful as you think. So I don't know if either one of you want to talk through, I mean, you've touched on it in a little more detail, why it's important to have, you know, what's been called a full ride, like someone to cover your tuition and to actually offer you work experience at the same time. Why is that important?
I'll kind of speak to that. I think it's important to understand that most of these young people, when they're entering into a program like ours, they're investing a lot of time that they would likely probably spend at work, and so making money, right, and bringing it back into their household. And so there's a little bit of a risk assessment that has to take place. And so the ability for them to be a part of the program is great and to build up your skills, but if they are already lacking the social capital, the ability to call up someone and get access to the job that they're being trained in, then not guaranteeing something at a possibility at the end, it becomes less motivating for young people to make that risk assessment. But also, if we're talking about labor gaps and an employer is at the table understanding that there's a labor gap in their industry, then why would we not make a job available if it's possible, right? And that integrated learning opportunity really has helped for us, because I'll use an organization called Spin VFX. They had tapped out of the Canadian market, were spending a lot of money in the US, so they wanted to train folks. So we said, okay, how many people could you hire if you could? They said 12, okay, great. The importance of having them in the room when we're building the curriculum was they were able to make it as realistic as possible to work at Spin VFX. Because we can, in theory, think, you know, but really preparing them for long hours, having someone from that organization actually teach it, build relationships so when they show up, it's not a brand new world, right? There's so many things that, advantages to having an employer involved in the delivery, and also understanding that the importance of having your basic needs met while you're in the program, and then at the end being able to kind of continue that trajectory, rather than, you know, often we don't think about young people's kind of resilience, right? And so the stop and pause, that can become very discouraging, and sometimes could just disengage somebody completely.
I think the phrase that's really sticking with me is the concept of risk assessment, which is not something I think a lot of employers consider. Ian, I want to send it back to you. Is that something that you and your team discussed in the development of your program, and how did you address it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we have excellent partners on the program, the Global Institute for Food Security, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, a number of private companies in the agriculture and ag-tech space, and, you know, they've been integral in forming the program, and their trainees will rotate through those organizations to get practical experience. But maybe coming back to the point about funding for students and you know, the idea of a full ride, one point I want to make is that we do not pay graduate students enough in Canada, full stop. And that is reducing our ability to attract and retain graduate students and reducing our competitiveness. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that a full ride is not even necessarily enough in the current climate.
Right, I mean, if they're living away from home or they don't have a support system, the tuition is only a small part of what they need to cover.
Absolutely.
We have a few minutes left. Before I open it up to questions, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss out on any opportunities for any of our panelists to share. So I'll go back to each of you. Agapi, is there anything that, if there's, maybe I'll put it this way, if there's one thing you would like our attendees to take away from this discussion, what would it be? Or something that we've missed in our chat?
Yeah, I think it's always really important when I get in front of folks, particularly ones that work for corporations, to understand that this is a we problem. Like the labor gaps that we're facing, like this is going to be an economic issue for all of us. And we have untapped resources like youth, like immigrants, and I think oftentimes, sometimes the narrative of like, oh, well, our housing crisis is because of immigrants and young people are not doing, they are actually our ticket out of this problem. And the more we start to understand that, the more respect we will give to it and attention. And that's really what I think I want people to walk away with, is that we're not asking for you all to look at this as a favor or the good thing to do. It makes economic sense. And whether you like these groups or not, they are going to be our ticket out of this.
All right, thanks. Shamira, same question.
So you know what, I mean, basically, I'm just going to agree completely with Agapi, and it is easy to do. It totally is, because if everybody talks about corporate social responsibility, then we should stop being sort of, performative, and we've got to go in deep, and we have consulting firms who could work with social service agencies, bring young people in, bring them together, and offer opportunities. It is easy to do, we just have to be intentional.
Okay, and Ian.
Yeah, great. I just wanted to bring back to just how important I think the national scorecard and those sort of initiatives are that Century Initiative is presenting today. In our space of agriculture, we actually had just released a national index on agri-food performance, which has a very similar mandate, but really targeted at the space of agriculture to look at environmental, economic, social well-being, food safety, and integrity factors. And it's so important for us to know where we're at, know where we need to make progress, and also hopefully celebrate the successes when we get there.
All right, thank you. So we possibly have time for one question before we have to wrap. Sorry, I think this lady over here had her hand up. In the stripes? That's you.
Hi, so my name is Anna. I would say I'm a very small percentage of the group. I'm a youth. So I wrote down my question. When you talk about youth and creating work, for example, the labor group, the labor gaps for them, there are so many opportunities that are available. For example, at school, they show internships, programs, and scholarships. But I would say they're very inaccessible for us. They seem very complicated to get in and very, I guess, what do you say, scary. So how would you say, like, for example, if you know type of thing, like, for example, this event, I wouldn't say a lot of people my age would be able to get in here because they don't know how to do this. But how would you break the barrier for the motivated youth that they're not able to figure out about these things because their parents wouldn't know, like, it's not generational, they just came to Canada, but how would you break the barrier for the motivated youth that want to jump in but they can't?
Yeah, that's a great question, and for the record, I take responsibility for going over time. Thank you for asking that. I'm going to leave it to our panel to respond.
Because I work with young people every day, I think the responsibility is on us to come to you. I think that obviously, like, these things are can be very scary, and I think empowering young people to be brave and just like call people up and be like, hey, look, how do I how do I get to this? Because it seems super complicated. I think empowering our young people to do that, but I also think all of us have a shared responsibility in this room to be going into high schools, going into universities, going into community centers, and talking about what it is that you're doing so that you can bring the young people here and give them a safe space. There's a dynamic there, and I think we need to reach down, and the advice I'd give to a young person is like, reach out and hold folks accountable.
All right, well, thank you so much, and we're gonna have to leave it there. I would like you to join me in thanking Agapi, Ian, and Shamira for their time. And now I want to invite my colleague, Matt Lundy, who's an economics reporter with the Globe and Mail, to come to the stage. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sandra. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Lundy, economics reporter at the Globe and Mail. I'm happy to have the opportunity to interview the Honorable Ahmed Hussein, Federal Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, who is joining us virtually today. I think we might be having a technical issue, so you might just hear audio from him. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Hussein. Okay, I think we're going to temporarily move on here. I would like to invite up to the stage Umar Diko, National Director of Stakeholder Relations in Quebec with Windmill Microlending, and hopefully we come back with the minister for you guys.
Thanks, Matt. Adapt and overcome. Really appreciate being here today to talk about the impressive work that our organization does supporting newcomers across Canada. And I promise I'm going to keep my remarks short because I know I'm standing between you and the actual real star of the evening, who, by the way, has traveled from very far to be here with us today. And to be fair, I'm also super excited to hear his remarks because I'm a bit of a nerd. So this is not a total selfless act of kindness here. Throughout the day, the speakers, our distinguished guests have all talked about solutions and strategies to rebuild a strong Canadian workforce and the need to harness the power of the current Canadian workforce that we have, that include newcomers, to address labor shortages and support economic growth in the future. And I can tell you that that's exactly what our organization, Windmill Microlending, has set out to do. Windmill helps newcomers achieve their full potential here in Canada. We do this by offering affordable microloans coupled with tailored wraparound support such as career success coaching, financial literacy, and mentorship for newcomers who lack access to mainstream credit. And Minister Baines mentioned it this morning and he referenced it. It was a great layup for me, and I was like, oh my God, he just talked about what I wanted to talk about. Every year, Canada welcomes hundreds of thousands of newcomers and refugees, many of them highly skilled, highly educated in professions and trades. But too often, as we know, their credentials are not recognized in Canada. And without access to credit, they're unable to afford the cost of accreditation and licensing. And this leads to long-term underemployment and unemployment and poverty among newcomers. This issue is well documented, and Canada loses valuable talents in professions where they're currently needed. We've all heard the stories, and Mr. Baines mentioned that, of highly qualified immigrants and refugees who are stuck in survival jobs to make ends meet because they cannot afford the cost of accreditation and licensing, and because their credentials are not recognized in Canada. And this is not a unique story of a few. This is a story very common to many newcomers in Canada, and that of my own father when we immigrated to Canada 18 years ago. And you can think of the magnitude of that issue when it's compounded by the thousands. And RBC has a report that actually estimates the loss in GDP from the underemployment of newcomers to be around $20 billion a year. This is not all doom and gloom. The good news is there are organizations on the ground that are supporting newcomers to achieve their credential recognition and achieve professional success here in Canada. And some of them are working at the grassroots, and this is how Windmill actually started. We started as a grassroots movement in Calgary supporting internationally trained healthcare workers in 2005. Our founder, a woman, a Calgary-based clinical psychologist, she was very frustrated as she discovered that many of the cleaning crew at the hospital where she worked were actually internationally trained healthcare workers, just unable to practice in their professions because of the lack of recognition of their professions and obstacles to licensing and accreditation. And one of those main obstacles was actually access to affordable financial support for them to be able to achieve that. So, and I love this story. And she decided to actually take action, not wait for the government, not wait for other people to do it. She gathered a group of like-minded women that were equally interested in social justice, equity, supporting newcomers, and she raised the support to launch this innovative concept, make affordable microloans to immigrants who lack access to credit and could not afford the cost of accreditation. They raised the first $30,000 and made our first 6 loans in 2005. And since then, we've grown to become one of the most successful and the largest organizations providing microloans to new immigrants in Canada. We provided over $76 million in microloans managed internally by our own organization and delivered internally by our own organization. We've supported over 8,000 newcomers across the country to achieve professional success, enabling them to raise their income level on average by more than 3-fold. And our repayment rate is equally impressive. 97% has remained over 97% for the past 10 years. And you can see unemployment and underemployment among our clients to be dropping significantly by the time they receive their services. And I know I'm very short on time here, so I'm gonna conclude. The reality is the shortage of talent is not a unique Canadian issue. As we all know, it's a global issue. And with the declining birth rates globally, the competition for talent is going to continue to increase. Countries that facilitate the equitable, efficient, and affordable process of integrating international newcomers will flourish and prosper, while others will lose out. For Canada, this is not only the right and moral thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do, to build an inclusive workforce of the future, and especially as we are poised to welcome a record number of newcomers in the next couple of years. And I know Minister Hussein may be listening, but I want to commend the federal government for increasing these targets and for setting out these ambitious targets and for working with organizations like Windmill to create the conditions and set an environment where these newcomers can come to Canada and flourish and prosper here in Canada. So I would like to conclude my remark by thanking the Globe and Mail for inviting us to be here today and for convening this important forum. I think it's important that we all sit in the same room and discuss the solutions and the strategies that we can use to harness the potential of those skilled newcomers and convert it into prosperities, not only for themselves and their families, which is very important, but also for Canada. With that, I now have the honor of introducing our closing keynote speaker of the evening, who has traveled all the way from Singapore to be here with us today. I hope he's coping very well with the jet lag. Parag Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor, a world traveler, and a best-selling author. He is the founder and CEO of Climate Alpha, an AI-powered analytics platform. His latest book is called Move, Where People Are Going for a Better Future, which is very timely for the current environment. Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and was featured in Wired magazine Smart List. The stage is yours, Mr. Parag.
Thanks so much. Great to meet you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure, such an honor to be here. Thank you, Omar, for that generous introduction. And my remarks are going to pick up exactly where he left off. We didn't even plan that segue. But I do want to say that I used to come to Canada a lot more frequently before COVID. And I almost worried with COVID dragging on and my travel schedule changing. I was like, is Canada going to reach 100 million before I get back to Canada? And I'm pleased to say I made it just in time, because you are growing at breakneck pace, shattering all records. In fact, as you know, well before COVID, especially in light of trends that hail from that country south of the border, where, as you might have guessed, I grew up. A lot of people have been talking about protectionism and nationalism and xenophobia and populism as just these overwhelming global norms and memes of Trump, Brexit, and so forth. And I was always able to say, but look at Canada, don't forget there's Canada, leading light to the world. And maybe despite the incredibly progressive, high quality analysis that I've seen in this report. It's really benchmarking and assessing your progress in assimilating new migrants, creating jobs and opportunities. As I said, I want to pick up where Omar left off, because what a lot of you have been analyzing rightly in this shortage, talent shortage, is really a war for young talent.
Thank you, Parag, and what an excellent way to close today's program. Unfortunately, we weren't able to bring in Minister Hussein, so we are going to wrap things up. Before we head outside for some drinks and networking, I would like to thank all of you in the audience, in person and virtual, for joining us today. And on behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would also like to thank the following partners for making today possible. They include Century Initiative, Palette Skills, Future Skills Center, World Education Services, Windmill Micro Lending. And thank you again, and I would like to invite those in the room to join us outside for some refreshments and to continue networking. Thank you.